Amen. Amen. After being born and then growing up, we read in verses 10 and 11 of Exodus chapter 2 that will draw your attention to the chapter and to Acts and Hebrews as well. But verses 10 and 11, we read, "The child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She called his name Moses, and she said, Because I drew him out of the water. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. He went out unto his brethren, looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren." If ever there was someone who could give a speech and stir a nation, then of course it was Sir Winston Churchill. On the 17th of April 1945, he addressed the House of Commons just 5 days after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, who of course had become something of a friend to him. And in this address, he gave a very interesting insight into the timing of Roosevelt's death. He said this. He said, "In Roosevelt there died the greatest American friend these islands have ever known. He died in the harness, and we may well say the battle harness." But he said this at the end of the speech. What an enviable death he had. What an enviable death he had. He died in an enviable death in the sense that he died at an enviable time to die. What do I mean by that? Well, when Churchill said that, he essentially was referring to the fact that Hitler was dead, that all that went with that was virtually gone as well. The war in the Pacific, it looked as though it was heading for victory, and so the free world could remain what it desired to be. It could remain free. And when we think about Franklin Roosevelt through the eyes of Churchill and having an enviable death, Moses is at the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Because if he had an enviable death, well, Moses, you could say, he had a very unenviable birth. What do I mean by that? Well, you think of all the detail that we looked at last week. It certainly was not a nice time to be born. It certainly was very, very difficult. He was born into a hostile world, as we saw. He was born as a Jew, and he wasn't born in Israel. He was born in Egypt. He was born at a time when baby boys were anything but safe. And as for God's people, they, of course, were suffering terribly. They were slaves. They were being misused. They had been beaten. And, yes, to put it quite bluntly, some of them had even been murdered by the hand of Pharaoh. And yet this was the scene of time that Moses stepped into. Amazingly, as I have mentioned, we have the first 2/3 of Moses' life in this one chapter. The rest of the book and the rest of the study, it is really concerned with the final 40 years of the life of Moses. Now, the life of Moses, it fits into 3 segments very, very nicely. And I mentioned Acts chapter 7 because Acts 7 actually breaks Moses' life down for us. It says in Acts 7 verse 20, when he was born, speaking of Moses. In Acts 7 verse 23 it says this, when he was a full 40 years old. And then in Acts 7 verse 30 it says when the 40 years expired. In other words, it draws attention to his birth, draws attention to him when he was 40 years old, and it draws attention to the fact that those 40 years had expired, and of course he then, by deduction, was 80. D.L. Moody has an immortal quote on the life of Moses, and I've maybe mentioned it once or twice, but it certainly bears quoting again, or it needs to be quoted at this time. He said this about the life of Moses. He spent the first 40 years of his life thinking he was a somebody. And what do I mean by that? Well, there he was, and he was in Pharaoh's palace, and he was learned in all of the ways of Egypt. But then something happens, and we find that the next 40 years of his life, he realizes that he's a nobody. He spends the next 40 years of his life from 40 to 80, just south of Israel, in the desert, there in Midian, just looking after a handful of sheep, and looking after his wife Zipporah, and his son here, as we have read of, Gershom. But then the final 40 years of his life, he learned what God could do with a nobody. And he, of course, led the people of God through the wilderness wanderings. And I believe, folks, really, you sit in one of those 3 camps this morning. You see, sadly, there are some, and they feel as though they are somebody. Perhaps you've gone the next step and God has chipped away at you and He has humbled you and He has taught you that if you're ever to be anything in the work of God and for Jesus Christ, then we need to learn what Martin Luther said: until a man is nothing, God can make nothing of that man. And maybe you're just at the final juncture of Moses' life. I realize that probably none of us realistically will see 120, but at the same time, we all should learn that God can use nobodies. And you think of Moses here. What, over 2 million people for 40 years, with no compass, with no map, just a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And for 40 years, he learned what God could do with a nobody. Now, which camp are you in this morning? Are you in the camp, I trust we'll all, as we go through this study, and especially as we think of the life of Moses, we'll all learn that we are nobodies before God. And in learning that, it will not just stay there. Sometimes people feel, well, I'm a nobody and I can do nothing for the Lord. But we need to learn that God takes nobodies and He uses them, just like He did Moses. So let's think today about the making of Moses, and really just look at the first two stages, you might say, of his life, when he was born and then when he was 40. I've broken this up into three segments: the infant years of Moses, then we have the influential years of Moses, and then we have the isolated years of Moses. So first of all, the infant years of Moses, whenever he was born and then when he was a child. And we find out about his birth in Exodus 2, verses 1 and 2. We read, there went a man of the house of Levi, that's his father, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived, bare a son, and she saw him that he was a goodly child, and she hid him 3 months. We last week looked at the fact that it was a hostile world that Moses was born into. And now we find here was a godly couple. We read that both of them were of the tribe of Levi. And what do? They get married, and then God blesses them with a child. Now, we're not told their names here, but in Exodus chapter 6, verses 18 and 20, we have some very interesting detail about Moses' father and mother. If I was to ask you today, what's the name of Moses' father, I wonder, would you be able to answer the question? Moses' father was called Amram, and of course Moses' mother was called Jochebed. Now, it's a very interesting family setup, because Amram, whilst he was his father, Jochebed, believe it or not, was the aunt of Amram. So that's right, Moses' father married his own aunt. Now you might raise the question immediately, is there not something improper about this? And we must remember that in Bible times it was fairly common to have lawful marriages with close relations. And it wasn't until the Mosaic law later on forbade those marrying within those close relations was it then obviously a sin. Just another thing to think about on that matter. Adam and Eve had 3 children. Of course, they were boys, Seth, Cain, and Abel. The question must be asked, well, how did they have children? And the only logical answer can be that they had to have children with their sister. So God had to do this in the early stages of the existence of mankind to literally populate the world. So He did this here. But you know, Moses' parents, well, they were great individuals of faith. Because whilst Moses appears in the Hall of Faith, his parents also appear in the Hall of Faith. They're actions. In Hebrews 11, verse 23, we read, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents. Listen to it, because they saw he was a proper child. But there's something here that tells us about the faith of his parents. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. Not afraid of the king's commandment. What was the king's commandment? That all the baby Hebrew boys should be killed. But they were not afraid of the king's commandment. And so we find the events here. After 3 months, we read of it in verse 2. He was a goodly child, means he was beautiful. And she hid him 3 months. So what does she do? She makes a little ark, doesn't she? And she puts little baby Moses and she places her son into the water. Now, verse 4 tells us that his sister, that's Miriam, his older sister, well, she was watching all of these events transpire. Little baby Moses be placed into the water. We know the story, I'm sure, well. But you know, child of God, there's a wonderful providence in this. I was listening to someone preaching it this week, and they said they just wondered, did God cause baby Moses to cry at the exact moment that Pharaoh's daughter comes along the scene and sees this little baby? Because this is essentially what happens. Pharaoh's daughter, she finds Moses, a little child, and she comes to Miriam, of course Moses' sister, and she asks a very simple question. Is there somebody to look after this baby boy? Remember, it was the Hebrew ladies that were looking after the children. And what does Miriam say? Well, yes, of course, there's a lady here named Jochebed. And she will look after this little baby boy for you. And she will then return baby Moses to you whenever he grows up, whenever he is of age. So I want you to see here, when we think about the infant years of Moses, that he was trained in the school of home. Long before he ever went to the school of Egypt, he was trained in the school of home. Verse 9, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away, nurse it for me, I will give thee wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. Now, who was this lady? Well, it was Jochebed, as I've said. All of these providential events, having the mother of Moses there, having Pharaoh's daughter there, having his sister Miriam there. And here we find, under the king's commandment, can I say, the very commandment that we read that they did not obey at the beginning. Under the king's commandment, under the commandment of Pharaoh's daughter herself. We find Moses' mother Jochebed is looking after him. Now, I think this is interesting because after we read of his father, he's barely mentioned again in the Bible. And what I want you to especially see here, mothers, is that it's almost as if the curtain is just pulled back and we are taken into this Jewish home. And what I want you to see here, mothers, is the role that the mother plays, especially the mother. Undoubtedly Amram was there, but he was a Kohathite. He was a Levitical priest. He had a task to do. The main role here is the mother, as it says in verse 9, the woman took the child and nursed it. Now, what would she have been teaching little Moses before she has to hand him over to the Egyptians? She's promised to do this, so whenever he comes of age, what would she be teaching him? Well, she would be teaching little baby Moses and then little infant Moses about the person of God, wouldn't she? Remember, the Egyptians, they worshipped different gods. They had a god for the sun. They worshipped animals as well. But no. She was instilling into little baby Moses about who God was. She was teaching him about Jehovah, the one God, the one true and living God. She was also, I believe, teaching him about the precepts of God, how God should be worshipped. Remember, I said last week in the message that as Joshua explained, the people of God were sadly, they were falling into idolatry. I would venture to say that the vast majority of the people of God had fallen into idolatry. So here we have this godly mother Jochebed, and she teaches Moses, you're not to go to the great temple of the sun and worship the god Ra. No. She is teaching him that if you're to come before God, she's teaching him, I believe, that you must come through the sacrifice of, the substitute of another. And there's so much more we could say. The promises of God. You know, it's amazing because Joseph, whenever he died in Genesis chapter 50, Joseph looked at all of his brothers. Remember the brothers that he had been reunited with. And in Genesis 50 prophetically, he said this. In verse 24, Joseph said to his brethren, I die, but listen to it, God will surely visit you, bring you out of this land, out of the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Joseph said, yes, you're here in Egypt, but you're not here to stay. Sometime God will visit you and will bring you back to the promised land, the land where you ought to be in. And I just wonder, was this mother Jochebed, was she telling Moses, you know, Moses, we've been here hundreds of years now, and old Joseph, the patriarch, he told us there's going to come a time when God will visit his people and he will bring us out to bring us back into Canaan. Now let me ask you, mother, in those quiet, precious hours that you have with your children, Are you taking time to instill valuable, eternal principles into the heart of your little ones? About the person of God, who He is. About the precepts of God, how we are to live for the Lord, how we are to worship the Lord. About the promises of God. Mother, are you taking time to have a Jochebed-like influence on the little one who's perhaps in before you, or that God has given to you? Are you doing what God has asked you to do in that loving, intimate way? That, ladies, let's be honest, that we Amrams can't do. There's a loving and an intimate way that only the mother can teach the child. Now the father is to be a prophet to the home. He is to declare the word of God to the home. However, you know as well as I do, the mothers, they have that warm, that intimate connection with the children. You know, I read the story, a humorous story of an old character of an evangelist in America, and he was preaching at meetings. He called them revival meetings. A lady came to him afterwards, after the service, and she said this to him. She said, "Dear brother, I believe God has called me to preach." And he said, "Bless God, hallelujah, dear." And he then asked her, "How many children have you got, dear?" And she said, 12. And he said, "Hallelujah, not only has God called you to preach, but He's already given you a ready-made congregation, 12 children to preach to." Ladies, God has given you people to preach to every single day. Your children, your grandchildren. Be a Jochebed-like influence in their lives. He was taught in the school of home, but I also want you to see then that he was tutored in the school of Egypt. Verse 10, we read, "The child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. She called his name Moses and said, because I drew him out of the waters." Isn't it interesting that Moses was actually named by Pharaoh's daughter and not Jochebed? It's an interesting detail. Why was he called Moses? Well, Moses simply means drawn out one. And here we have Pharaoh's daughter. She drew him out, and then she handed him over to the Hebrews. Of course, Jochebed, as we have seen. But now the time came where Jochebed makes good on her promise, and she hands the little baby Moses over to this Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. Now, the amazing thing about it is this. Josephus, a Jewish historian, an extra-biblical historian, he makes the point that Pharaoh wouldn't have had a son. It was Pharaoh's daughter that Moses was given to. So when you put all of that together, that means that Moses was next in line to be the king of Egypt. Now there's an interesting detail, because in order to be king of Egypt, he had to be taught in the ways of Egypt. And we're sort of hinted at it here, but Stephen's great sermon in Acts 7 verse 22 makes it abundantly clear that Moses was a head and shoulders kind of a student. Acts 7:22 tells us Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now listen to this, mighty in word and in deeds. Bible commentators would tell us that the university essentially that Moses was taken to, the school of Egypt, as he was schooled in the way of Egypt, there were some people that never got out of it. But it seems Moses, he no sooner was in it till he graduated from it. And it says he was mighty in word and deed. What I want you to see here is Moses was a giant of an intellect. He seemed to pass with flying colours. He was mighty in words. He was mighty in deeds. As we're going to see, Moses was a real character, you know. He had charisma, knowledge, intellect. And perhaps Moses was thinking to himself as he was sitting there in this, as I've called it, university in Egypt, what good is this doing me? And you know, all of that learning and all of that intellect, that would be used 40 years on, whenever Moses had to lead over 2 million people for 40 years in the wilderness. Let me just encourage the young people here. Sometimes we despise university. And I know because I was there myself before going to college. And it's amazing, you know, that things that you learn in school and things that you learn in university, do you know what God is doing in your life, young people? He's shaping your mind, He's giving you talents, and He's shaping you for the future. I don't know what that future is, and perhaps you don't even know what that future is yourself. But what I would say is this, young people, Go in the light that you have, because you never know what God will do with a piece of paper or a certificate or a degree or some form of qualification. And here's another challenge. I believe there are people here in the congregation, and you've got great intellect. Excellent intellect. Are you like Moses? And are you using your intellect? Are you channeling that intellect for the glory of God? God gives us intellect. We're not all the same. Some of us get A's, and some of us get C's, and some of us get D's. God gives us all varying talents and gifts. And here was Moses, and he was being schooled in the ways of Egypt, and there was a purpose in it all. Billy Sunday said, more men fail through lack of purpose than lack of talent. There's so much talent. The question is, are you using that? Are you driving, being driven on with purpose for the glory of God, using the talent God has given you? The infant years of Moses, we must move on. Think with me about the influential years of Moses. The influential years of Moses. Verses 11 and 12. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he went out to his brethren, looked on their burdens, spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of the brethren. And he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. What an interesting incident in the Bible. So Moses, it seems that when you read Acts chapter 7, God begins to speak to Moses, begins to stir Moses. I believe personally that God actually, from the detail in Acts chapter 7, God is already showing Moses he has a great plan for him. But Moses, he runs before he's sent. And Moses leaves the palace in Egypt, leaves his place of learning, and he goes back to his own people. And whenever he goes back to his own people, what does he see? He sees one of them old Egyptians smiting one of his people, the Israelites. And I love the way he's put it, because Moses, he just looks this way and he just looks that. Anybody seen me? No. And he smacks him, he strikes him, and he actually kills him. So that in verse 12, he buries him in the sand. Now verses 13 and 14, the next day, now there are these two Israelites and they're having a fight. And Moses comes to them and he tries to reconcile them. And of course verse 14, and he's absolutely right in saying this, who made you prince, who made you king? I just saw you bury an Egyptian yesterday. And then verse 14, towards the end of it, we simply read, Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. What we must understand is that these are the actions of someone whose heart God is doing to do something. Now these actions have been wrong. He's killed someone. He's murdered someone with his bare hands. This is wrong. This is sin. However, and I might take time just to deal with this next week and this whole incident in greater detail, but what was going on in the heart of Moses here in these influential years when he's grown up now? Well, Hebrews 11 gives us a great clue into what was going on in the heart of Moses. We read in Hebrews 11 verse 24, and these words are mind-boggling. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, that's now, he's come to years in Exodus 2, in these verses 11 through 15, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Now listen to this. Remember, this is Moses. This is thousands of years before Christ comes. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt ye respect, and to the recompense of the reward. Verse 24 says he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's mind-boggling. He refused to be, I'm not the son of a princess. Do you think of all of the avenues, all of the doors that would have been opened to Moses? Think of all the temptation. All of the Egyptian temptation that would have come along his way. And yet we read here that by faith he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Notice here what he turned from. He turned from all of the privileges of the palace. He turned from all of the pleasures of Egypt. It says here, he turned from the treasures of Egypt here in verse 26 and 27. What did he turn from? He turned from everything that was set before him. What did he turn towards, I believe, more importantly? Verse 26. He esteemed the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, and had respect and recompense of the reward. The term esteem here, it means to count. You may or may not remember, but in the study of Philippians, I spoke about how Paul counted all things but dung that he might win Christ. And I mentioned that was an accounting term. How he was doing this profit and loss, how he was weighing it all in his mind. It's the same term here in Hebrews 11. Here we see Moses, and he's, on one hand, he's weighing up all of the treasures of Egypt. But he turns from them. And now on the other hand, he's weighing up something of far greater value. It says here the reproach of Christ. And verse 27, he respect unto the recompense of the reward. What is he doing here? Very simply, he is turning to Christ. And it seems that when you read the detail of Acts 7 and Hebrews chapter 11, there is something of Christ revealed to Moses in this occasion. And he turns from the world and he turns to a coming Redeemer. Now I just wonder, how did God do that? How did God reveal something of Christ to Moses? Well, let's take a step back. What is the book of Exodus, child of God? The book of Exodus is a book of redemption. It's all about God redeeming, bringing out his people. Here we see in chapter 2, notice the detail here. How does God redeem his people? He redeems his people very simply by bringing a child into the equation who will redeem his people. I just wonder, even though we're not told in Exodus 2, but from the detail of Acts chapter 7, where you read of God stirring his heart, did God say to Moses, I wonder, we don't know, but I wonder, did he say to Moses, Moses, you're a picture of a greater Redeemer, a coming Redeemer. As you were born as a child, as you grew up to redeem your people, so there is a greater one coming. He will step into this scene of time. He will be a child. He will be conceived of a virgin. Why? To redeem his people. And you know, Moses, he weighs it all up. And he turned from the world, as we sang in 637, to seek Jesus. To seek Jesus. J.C. Ryle has a great sermon in Hebrews 11, and this particular juncture in Moses' life, and he says this: Moses makes 3 of the greatest sacrifices man can ever make. He gives up rank, he gives up riches, and he gives up enjoyment and pleasure. All for what? All for a special relationship with a covenant God. All because verse 25, he realizes, and look, we've heard this verse quoted, I'm sure, many times, but he realizes that the pleasures of sin only last for a season. So when you put all of this together, let me very simply ask you, as a Christian, weigh up treasures of this old world and look at what is set before you. A relationship with God. God says, come and walk with me. Yes, there are pleasures in sin, but it's only for a season. However, you have eternal enjoyment in glory laid up for you, and even the joy of walking in close communion with God. Even what it says in verse 27, he had respect on the recompense of the reward. Moses here, long before the first coming of Christ, recognizes that even at his second coming, there's going to be a recompense, there's going to be a reward for deeds done in the body, for his faithfulness to God and faithfulness to Christ. There's some here this morning, and the old world still has a wee tug on you. You're not saved. Turn from it. All these things are temporary and transient. And turn to Jesus Christ, just like Moses did. There are those here, and you're in the influential years in your life, young people. And you know, I will say this, young people, who you decide to be now, in your teens and 20s and early 30s, will determine what you will be when you go on in life. Resolve to be a committed Christian now. Resolve to keep this old world at a distance. Because you will find in making that decision now that you will reap the rewards of it in the years and in the decades to come. Jim Elliot, the great missionary, he said, he is no fool. He gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Gives what he cannot keep. We can't keep this old world. We can't keep the riches that this old world offers us. We give it up to gain that which we can't lose and can't be taken away from us. The infant years, the influential years. I want to see lastly, and very, very quickly, the isolated years of Moses, verse 15. When Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. Pharaoh hears he's killed an Egyptian. What does Moses do? He just goes on the run. Verse 15, he finds himself south of Israel in the desert of Midian. Do you imagine yourself, you imagine that you're Moses. And I believe Moses, his heart was being stirred to do something. But you imagine now, I've been caught out, I looked this way and that, but someone was looking all along. God, of course, was watching. Verse 15, he's thinking to himself, Lord, I've blown it, I've messed up here big time. I believe you don't work for me to do, Lord, but I've taken matters into my own hands, and I've blown it. I've messed it up. Here he finds himself by a well, Midian. But you know what? God is going to teach him here in these isolated years that he was a nobody. Firstly, through the mistake that he's made, obviously. He's not perfect. He's going to learn that. He's learned that now. But then I want you to see here what he gives to him. He gives him a well, he gives him a wife, and he gives him a work to do. Here we read that he meets Reuel, who's also known as Jethro. Jethro, of course, is a daughter whose name is Zipporah. Verse 21, Moses was content to dwell with this man. He gave Moses Zipporah his daughter. What was God doing here in these 40 years in Midian? Very simply, he was teaching Moses this, and we are almost done. That before Moses was ever fit to lead 2 million people through the wilderness, he had to spend 40 years of his life looking after a well, looking after his wife, and looking after a little flock of sheep. The great 40 years that he had in the final 40 years of his life, leading 2 million. Where did he learn how to do that? He learned that God was forming him, my friend, in these isolated years, just looking after literally a handful of sheep, a well and his wife. I say looking after the well because of the detail of what we find in verse 17. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Moses was standing guard on this well, and other shepherds, they were coming to draw from this well. It obviously wasn't theirs. And Moses drove them away from the 7 daughters of this man Jethro. So he had a well, then he was given a wife, and he was given a work to do. And you will find that, child of God. Long before you're called to lead people and do a more public work for the Lord, you know what he does? He places you at home. Gives you a family. He tells you to serve the Lord in what I'm not being disparaging, but what I would call the monotony of family life, the coming and the going, and the just showing up. Moses had to just show up at the well, had to just show up at the work that he had to do, and he had to show up with his family. He had to look after Gershom and others. He had to show up, and he had to prove himself faithful in the backside of the desert, quite literally in the wilderness, long before God would take him through a wilderness and lead 2 million people. The lesson, my friend, is that this is always God's way. He proves you in a little before he gives you a lot to do. And you know, very often, child of God, there is a certain monotony that is attached with the work of God. Sometimes we get all romantic in notions about the work of God. There's a certain monotony to it. And what I mean by that is, you come, you go, you come, you go, you show up, and you continue to show up. And you show up at the same time, in the same place, preaching the same Christ of God. There's a certain monotony attached to it. But God is proving you faithful in the monotony at times of just showing up, coming and going. And he proves you in that. He proves you at the well, he proves you at your work, he proves you at your family. He shapes you in those monotonous everyday tasks that you do before he will call you to something greater and open up a more influential avenue of service for you. Let's put it like that. God did this in so many characters in the Bible. Elijah, he was sent to the boot camp at Cherith and then to Zarephath. Elisha followed Elijah for a long time. David, he spent years in seclusion before he ascended the throne. Paul had a period of approximately 3 years in Arabia, a period of seclusion where he was just alone there with God. Luke 16 verse 10 tells us this: he that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. And he that is unjust in the least is also unjust in much. If God cannot trust you with little, he will not entrust you with much. Because if you're unfaithful in little, you will then be unfaithful in much, and vice versa. So God is forming. He shapes us all, doesn't he? In those isolated years, the years where life just comes and goes, he's proving us all, preparing you for something he has for you to do. Abe Lincoln said, if you want to find out what a man is really like, top to bottom, give him power. Any man can stand adversity, but only a great man can stand prosperity. You know, as I thought about that quote, and I will finish with this, whenever I went into college, an old Christian that I esteemed very, very highly, he's in glory now, he asked me this very, very, very searching question that's in my mind often. Can God bless you? Can God trust you with his blessing? Can God trust you with his blessing? I would say this, folks, that's a very challenging thing. Can God trust you with responsibility? When things are going well, when he blesses you, can he trust you with it? Can he trust you with it? He was preparing Moses for that in these isolated years. The making of Moses. May God bless these thoughts to your hearts and lives. Time is gone. Thank you for your attentiveness. And just close in a wee word of prayer. Lord, we come before thee.